We'll conclude today's lecture by looking at a couple different types of while loops. So let's say we know exactly how many times our statements need to run. In this case, we can treat our while loop as what we call a counter-controlled while loop. Now, we will later on discuss a better way to handle this called a for loop, but we'll worry about that later. Right now, we're talking about counter-controlled while loops. So let's suppose we have a set of statements that need to run n times. And n in this case can be just some arbitrary number. We won't worry about exactly what n is. We just know it's going to run a specific number of times. We can use a counter variable, which will serve as our loop control variable. So we'll initialize our variable to 0 or a counter to 0 before we get into the loop. In our condition, we'll say if our counter is less than n, we'll run the body of our loop. And before we go back to our condition, so the last statement of our body, we'll increment our counter by 1. And then we just repeat this until eventually our counter becomes greater than or equal to n. Let's take a look at the format of a counter-controlled while loop. It looks something pretty much like this. So we have our counter, which is initialized to 0 outside of our while loop. Our condition in here, we'll check to see if counter is less than n. We do something inside our while loop, and then finally we increment the value of counter by 1. There we go, that's better. And we just keep repeating this until eventually counter is no longer less than n. So let's look at an example. Let's say we want to get the average of a set of numbers. Well, we can do something like this. In this case, the limit would be the upper bound of the number of things that we want to get the average of. So our counter will be set to 0. And as long as we have not read the limit number of numbers, we would just go into our body and say, take our current sum and add some input value. So the user types in something and that gets stored into sum, and we increment our counter. And then once we get out of the loop, after we've added however many items we want to add, we can just take the average by taking the sum and dividing by the counter. This code right here will take care of something like getting the average of 1,000 numbers. Now, you may not want to type in those 1,000 numbers yourself, but theoretically, we could do that by just using these lines of code. Counter-controlled while loops are great if we know the exact number of times we want to run our statements. But what if we don't know the exact number of times? Maybe instead we want to repeat our statements until we get some special value. We read in some specific number or some specific value. This type of value is what we call a sentinel. So just to give you an example, maybe we know that we're going to keep repeating input and we don't know how many times we're going to do it, but we know that the last input is some special value. Maybe it's 0, maybe it's -1, but we know it's something a little different than what we're used to. So what we do is we'll read the first item before we enter our while loop, and as long as what we read does not equal the sentinel, then we'll just execute the body of our loop. And we'll just keep doing this until we read that item that is exactly our sentinel value. So if it's a 0 or -1 or whatever we specify our sentinel value to be. This type of while loop is what we call a sentinel-controlled while loop. Let's take a look at the format of a sentinel-controlled while loop. It looks something like this, which is pretty similar to what we've seen before. We still have a loop control variable, except instead of initializing it to 0, we set it to whatever our first data item is. So we would do something like nextInt or next or whatever, and we store that value in our variable. And then the difference is in the condition of our while loop right here. So instead of checking to see if our loop control variable is less than something, we're checking to see if it's not equal to our sentinel. So as long as it's true, we're going to do something in our while loop, and then we're going to input our data item. And we just keep repeating this until our variable is the sentinel. Because like I said, we don't know the number of iterations, but we are given the fact that it is going to end by entering some specific value. So let's take a look at an example. Let's say I want to get the average of some arbitrary number of positive integers. Once again, we don't know how many positive integers we're going to have. We just know that we're going to keep getting positive integers. And if the user enters a non-positive integer, so a 0 or a negative number, that lets us know that we're done inputting data. So this is what our code looks like. So we still have some num that's going to be our input, and as long as our num is positive, we're going to add that to our sum, and we still need some count variable because even though we don't know how many number of iterations we have ahead of time, we're still going to need to know how many numbers we have if we want to get the average. We'll then ask the user to enter in another number, so that's where that next console.nextInt comes into play. And we just keep doing this until the user enters a 0 or a negative number. After that, we can get our average by taking our sum and dividing it by our count.